We are here today with some members of the New England Synod worship team, as well as our guest, Bishop Guy Erwin, who is not only bishop, but also a Reformation history scholar. And the main reason that we are together is we're starting a conversation here in New England about what is worship going to look like as we live into a new reality for the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months. In terms of a couple of different issues with this whole dynamic of virtual worship and some of the sacraments. And so I just thought there were two questions that I thought could kind of be the surrounding ones, and we're just going to have a general conversation. So the two that I wrote in advance were, what were the primary debates around the sacraments at the time of the Reformation? And how might those debates inform our discussions today? And the other one was, if the church and society are indeed changing, which we believe they are, what Reformation insights might help us today? So those are just kind of some general questions to get us going. Bishop Erwin, I know that you've been thinking about this in your own context for a while. You want to start us off? Thanks for doing this, by the way.
I'm happy to do that. We have a big church, and so I have been kind of careful not to wade into this in a public way, because I didn't want to feed the idea that this is something we can decide right now. I do think this is something that's a long-term conversation, and some of the discussion I have seen so far has been very unpleasant, and people have made assumptions about the character of individuals based on their positions on this. And I think that's really tough. But it's one of the side effects of living in a time of stress and crisis, and also having an overabundant supply of social media connections that allow us to talk about everything all the time, which is not always helpful. So I've been a little restrained in this. And one of the reasons I was willing to accept the invitation from Bishop Hazelwood was that you're a long ways away from me. Your synod geographically is the opposite corner of the country from mine. Though I have a close connection to New England. I became a Lutheran in New England at Unilu in Cambridge, and was formed in my Lutheran identity in the New England Synod, where I lived until 2000, so 20 years in that synod. So I feel like I connected to you, but also far enough away that this recording won't necessarily be the next thing all my pastors watch. And one of the reasons I've been a little hesitant about it is that people have jumped into this with both feet without really, I think, thinking through all of the implications for this conversation. And I know that comes about because of this moment of crisis. So let me say a little bit about the Reformation context and how I think it relates and doesn't relate to today. Luther wrote a lot about the Eucharist from the very beginning of his career right through to the end. It's one of the defining sort of touch point teachings for what distinguishes a Lutheran from a Roman Catholic on the one side, or from the medieval Catholic tradition in Luther's time, no Roman Catholicism yet. And on the other side of the theological spectrum, what distinguishes Lutherans from other kinds of reformers. So Lutherans have this mediating position in between. And what was at stake for Luther, I think, was to maintain the certainty that Christ comes to Christ's people in the assembly, in the bread and wine of the Eucharist, in a way that is far more than symbolic, but actually physically real. Now, we can get onto a metaphysical level and talk about, how real does something have to be before it's real? But for Luther, this involved a preservation of the belief that Jesus is present in the Eucharist in a way that transcends metaphor and image, and that actually goes into the area of the physical. So they say Luther was not a metaphysician, and he is, on the traditional side, on the side of the Catholic tradition up to his time, he wants to distinguish his point of view which he believes is simple and straightforward, over and against the Catholic understanding, complicated Aristotelian understanding of how two different things can be in the same place at the same time. That is, the bread and wine of the Eucharist and the body and blood of Christ. This is a problem that had bothered people before Luther to such a degree that the whole structure of the doctrine of transubstantiation gets built around it. People often say that Lutherans believe in consubstantiation, but that's a red herring. The term was never used in Luther's time. It was invented later by seminary professors, I think, to have a category that we could fit Lutherans in that was different. And it isn't really a thing at all. It's a term used to describe another understanding. But transubstantiation is about the means through which these two things can adhere in the same object, in the same place. And Luther rejects that categorically. We need no metaphysics to explain the presence of Christ in the bread and wine. For him, it's a matter of God's promise being trustworthy. That when Jesus says, "This is my body," Jesus is not saying, this is my real body in the appearance of something else. He's simply saying that it is. And so Luther's understanding that bread and wine continue to persist in the elements, but at the same time, the faithful understand that they are the body and blood of Christ as well, in a literal way, is the tension on which Luther's Eucharistic theology hangs. So he is saying, yes, two things can be in the same place at the same time, and it's part of the promise of God that the people of God can rely on the spiritual benefit of this reality. So that's kind of the how part. More technically, in the sense of the social aspect of the Eucharist, Luther, especially in his early writings, is more concerned with the danger that the church will deny the Eucharist to people, either by excommunicating them, excommunication and non-admittance to the table of the Lord was the most severe spiritual punishment that the church could lay on a person up until and past Luther's time, even to today, in a sense, in the Roman Catholic tradition. And we have some vestiges of that left too. That exclusion from the community and the gathered table is part of what we would understand as discipline within the Christian community. So the Eucharist has this status as something that is the last thing you'd want to lose. That if you lose it, you are in fact not a Christian anymore. If you're not eligible for communion, you don't belong to the community. This use, of course, has faded away. We don't really ever think about that anymore. But for Luther, that was a real threat. And as you know, he himself was excommunicated. So in his earliest writings, he's concerned to say to people that their salvation does not hang on whether they can receive the Eucharist or not. And his most important emphasis is that we can live without it. We can be saved without it. We are not dependent on the church's mass to become Christians or to be saved. Now, the thing I think that illuminates this a little more is the difference between Holy Communion and Holy Baptism. Because Luther believed fairly literally, as most of us probably don't believe today, that there was a direct link between baptism and salvation. That it was hard for Luther, in a world where everyone was baptized as a matter of form almost immediately after birth, it was hard for him to imagine a situation where that would be optional. So he sees baptism as indeed a gateway to salvation. And this was consistent with the whole church tradition up to his time, so that baptism had this, because it had this gateway function, it was considered necessary to salvation. And because it's necessary, you have to create an emergency provision in case somebody can't get it in the normal way. So, the custom which persists with us, that any Christian can carry out a baptism in a time of deep emergency. If a child is born near death, that someone can do this, anyone can do this, was already current in Luther's time, and he adopts that and accepts it without any change or any question. And as I say, up until modern times, I think that was pretty much the custom of Lutherans as well. So there's this area of difference between the two sacraments in that one has an emergency provision, the other is not conceived of as ever having an emergency use. So it doesn't have the same kind of gateway, kind of plan B in a sense. Also, one of the things that medieval Catholicism lifted up was that the perfect way to die was to have confessed all one's sins and receive Holy Communion as close as possible to the end of life. Now, all of us who have ministered in any kind of clinical setting know that there are a lot of things, physical and otherwise, that get in the way of Holy Communion when people are in extremis. And so we don't emphasize that so much. Lutheranism traditionally has not had a custom of carrying the sacrament to the dying. That's a custom that kind of died out with Catholicism in Lutheran countries. We do continue to lift up the sacrament of penance as being the appropriate one for people at the end of life. That to have be penitent about one's sins and to be promised absolution is one of the things that is Luther and the Lutheran tradition have seen as most consoling to the dying. And this is a substitute in a way for the Eucharistic participation that Roman Catholics maintained. This also has to go along with Luther's belief that the Eucharist should be freed up from any sense that the elements themselves are worshipped or adored, so that to carry, for example, to carry the Eucharist from the church, from a tabernacle to a home with a procession and a altar boy with the bell and all that stuff was showy and inappropriate. That the meal was for the people gathered at the meal on Sunday morning. So we've developed, of course, lots of pastoral approaches and taking communion to shut-ins and all that kind of thing that we have kind of grafted on to that understanding. And we have seen it as an extension of the table, that what is left over at the end can be carried by someone, not necessarily an ordained person, and shared with those who are physically prevented from coming in order that the sense of the body not be broken. So this doesn't have to happen every week, but it has to happen occasionally. So the other thing I want to bring up is that we have tended to connect weekly, the offering Holy Communion weekly in our worship services with weekly reception of the Eucharist, which in Luther's time was an entirely different thing. We think that Luther probably communed every couple weeks, maybe a little more often, a little less often, depending on the circumstances. But he didn't commune every Sunday, and most people didn't. Since 1215, of course, in the 13th century, it was expected of every Christian that they commune once a year. This interruption we have at the moment in Holy Communion would become for the ELCA a constitutional question were it to persist for more than a year, because we even define our membership on a once-a-year communion. That is a carryover from this 13th century custom. And of course, if you only communed once a year, you had to do it in the Easter season. If you communed regularly, it didn't matter whether you communed at Easter or not. But Easter was lifted up as the time when everybody who hadn't communed all that year needed to get in there. So in a way, having this pandemic occur during Holy Week and Easter has been symbolically significant for us. I know that's really caused a lot of anxiety. How can you have an Easter without Holy Communion? But it has only been since the reign of Pius X in the Roman Catholic Church, which is the beginning of the 20th century, that daily communion has been common in Roman Catholicism. Even in that tradition, weekly communion was the most you could do, and most people didn't do it. Of course, Catholics have an understanding of going to Mass, which has the same benefit, spiritual benefit, of communing, because you can unite yourself in faith with the miracle of the Eucharist that has happened before you, and with your soul and your eyes, you can feast in a way and get the same spiritual merit from having attended Mass as if you actually communed. So we have never done that. We've never made a space for Lutherans to come to church but not go to communion. Before the 20th century, that wasn't all that uncommon, because people were taught that they had to be especially prepared for communion. They needed to be in the right spiritual condition in order to receive worthily. And if they received unworthily, without the right level of repentance and faith, they were actually doing themselves a harm by communicating. We would not see that anymore. Obviously, that's not a current thought with us. We have it can do no harm kind of attitude toward it. But what's interesting to me is how much it has now become for us in our American, I want to say American Lutheran tradition. This is not universal to Lutheranism. It has become something that we really depend on people understand as not only a privilege opportunity to participate, but also a kind of right. And Roman Catholicism has moved with us in that regard, that it actually teaches in a way that, along with the obligation to attend Mass on Sunday, you have the right to have a Mass you can attend. And so it's been especially difficult for Catholics to deal with this interruption as well. I've looked to them for some models in this, because they have it. It's so important on the one hand, and so great a interruption on the other, and how they've had to wrestle with that. Anyway, one last point, and that is that Luther wanted to make a distinction between what he thought the right understanding and use of the sacrament of Holy Communion was, over and against what he saw as superstitious and exaggerated notions on the side of the tradition, the medieval tradition. But at the same time, he wanted to build a wall against a too casual understanding of it, or one, and this is what will surprise a lot of people, or one that too closely tried to reproduce the Last Supper story. Luther believed that the sacrament of the altar is not the Last Supper reenacted. And for the first 150 to 200 years of the era after Luther, there was a bitter controversy between Lutherans and Calvinists about how the Eucharist should not only be understood, but how it should be performed, because Lutherans were allergic to the idea that this should be like the Last Supper. So, for example, where Calvinists moved to an ordinary table, Lutherans retain the altar against the east wall. Where Calvinists moved to a single loaf, which has kind of now been enshrined in the use of the means of grace in a way I think is not appropriate, actually. Lutherans insisted on wafers, because that was the custom before. And also, it was not a joke about it's easier to believe in the real presence than it is to believe that a wafer is bread. But in fact, that's the point of it, is that it's not something you make a sandwich with. And the distinction is really important for Luther. When Karlstadt celebrates Holy Communion in civilian clothes at an ordinary table in the square in front of the church, instead of in all the normal ways, Luther preaches against this and drives him from town. This is going, for Luther, going too far. And so, but we have, I think, in the centuries since, we have kind of romanticized the life of Jesus and the situation in which Jesus found himself, and the story of the Last Supper, in ways that make us think we are getting closer to the meaning by getting closer to what we imagine the actions to have been. I mean, it's impossible for us to conceive of the Last Supper really in any real way. I mean, as a historian, I'll tell you it's a flight of fancy. But it has become spiritually important to us to think we're doing it in some ways. And so we have adopted some of those things. We have simplified, we have made it more like dinner. And of course, St. Paul gives us instructions to worry about that in his letters as well, that the meal that the early Christians celebrate is not to fill the belly, but to connect the community to Jesus. So Luther is trying to exclude understandings of the Eucharist that are too casual, that don't require a priest, for example. One of the reasons that you don't need the Eucharist for salvation is that not everybody had a priest. And when he writes to the Bohemian brethren, who had been excommunicated centuries before, he tells them that they should they should either go without, or they should create their own priests. Luther does believe, of course, that in a long-term emergency, a period of generation, where people do not have access to regularly ordained priests, they are entitled to create a new church structure and set apart their own people for this service. A lot of the arguments that I hear being used for virtual communion are consistent with that. It's just that question of, is 8 to 12 weeks a real emergency, as opposed to a break in the structure of the church that would be created by some more catastrophic event. And one last thing I want to talk about, well, no, I'll leave it with that. There's another aspect to the virtual part that concerns me, but that will probably come up in our conversation.
Thank you. I'm so glad that I'm recording this so I can go back and get. There's a lot in that.
Sorry, I went a little fast.
No, that's okay. That's good.
Maybe I could just say personally.
Yes.
That what made me a Lutheran is Luther's doctrine of the real presence in the Eucharist. That when I looked at what churches taught, I could not. I mean, I was a young adult. I was already studying Luther. I was a college student. And I had the whole menu of Reformation answers to the question of what the Eucharist is already before me. And I went to churches and I explored what they actually did. And I found that the church that was most authentic to me and most consistent with its own teachings was the Lutheran Church, and the way it handled the elements of the Eucharist, in the way it lifted this up as a feast of the community, the way in which it required the connection to the ordained ministry, but it didn't make a fetish of that either. So all of these things were things that really put me in Lutheranism. So the debate in some ways has unsettled me and has made me fear a little bit that the church in which I'm now a leader was not the church I thought I had joined. So that's sort of what's at stake.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that is what's at stake. And I see a couple of our colleagues here nodding heads. I'm particularly noting, Anna, your own experience coming out of Methodist tradition, responding to that. I want to open it up to other people. So other questions or comments that you want to make in response, just open your microphone and start in, and we'll engage here. Thoughts, questions?
So thank you, Bishop Erwin. I resonate with that last point you just made. One of the things I notice on a lot of the online conversations is the question of language that doesn't sound very Lutheran around validity, as in, can this happen? Which seems like not a question that should most concern us, because that speculates into the nature of God. Can God come through the internet and feed us? Can God be present virtually? That's one question, versus should we do it? Is this a good practice for the church? What is this, Bishop Hazelwood, in your document that you created, The Medium is the Message, what would offering communion in this way say about the Eucharist and the real presence and the nature of the community and the relationship to the ordained? I think it's almost idle speculation to wonder whether God can do something or not, and whether or not that would be quote unquote meaningful for someone, as if whether something is meaningful is a theological statement. Lots of things can be meaningful, and I have no doubt that a sort of remembering, it may facilitate the remembrance of Jesus, it may offer some point of connection to the church, but is that type of ritual actually the Eucharist that Luther and the church envision? Does it communicate with our ritual actions, if we, by the old idiom, as we pray so we believe, and what we do actually informs what people believe about the Eucharist? If that's mediated in this way, is that sending the same sort of message that Luther feared about with Karlstadt and other ways of celebrating that were, you use the word casual, but not consistent with what we say is happening in this rite.
Yeah, I don't think I really need to respond, except to say that, let me just say that the Lutheran answer to the question, can God do this, is always yes. The question is, should we do it?
I think of, St. Paul, all things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial.
Yeah, I also resonate with this is what made me a Lutheran. I will say that I've seen a lot of the debate online, and I've actually been heartened that it's so passionate, even if it's gotten a little low, because it means that we care about this, and it means that we're passionate, and I think that that's good. I know that church people aren't often very good at fighting. But one of my favorite things online is the Lutheran Insulter, where you can like pull up Luther's insults. Luther was great at this. So I wanted to make a point that I think that that's good. But yeah, the presence within the assembly and the gathered people, and the idea that the word of God was made flesh and the love of God made flesh is present in the assembly is what made me a Lutheran. So I've found that this has also got my pulse up a bit. I think the Reformation itself was a rhetorical enterprise. And so I think when we talk about using technology to kind of get us through this pandemic, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about for myself is that rather than that this moment requires a great amount of creativity, and that for me, simply offering the Eucharist via Zoom is not quite the creativity that this moment calls for, that instead we could help our people to discover God's presence outside of the walls of the church, and remind them that this is not the church's first pandemic, and they are not the first to go without the Eucharist and be unable to assemble, but that God still finds us anyway. And that presence doesn't need to be mediated through us, but that our role maybe can be to point to that and to empower people to kind of draw on those internal resources until we can gather again. And the last point I'll make that I've heard before that I find particularly compelling is that yes, the internet is a very powerful technology, and it enables us to feel like we're in the room with someone, or that someone is in the room with us. But it's not the first technology to make people feel that way. The telephone did the same thing. The television did the same thing. The radio did the same thing. And people were going without the Eucharist at those times also. And yet the clergy didn't quite make this jump. And so I think this is actually an incredibly powerful moment for us in kind of helping people to look outside the church, the walls of the church, for God's presence. And I think it could build us up to be stronger when we do come back together. So that's what I'll say.
Yeah, there's a lot in there that I'd like to engage with, but I'm going to pass and take my opportunity, especially what you talked about, sometimes things like this happen and it forces imaginative thinking. And why would we want to negate that opportunity? I think we should see this as an opportunity to figure out ways in which, how is the word communicated? Then also what you said about finding or opening our eyes to seeing different ways that God is present. But I think that's well put.
May I chime in?
Yeah.
I'm just, I grew up in the Calvinist tradition, and so that my people they were Dutch Calvinist pietists who did the gather around the table thing, Bishop Erwin, that you were alluding to. And so my thinking, I just lost my thread. Holding on to this promise of real presence in community and this middle, kind of this linking place that the Lutheran tradition has held between something too casual and too magical. real and powerful God who is beyond, nonetheless showing up in touchable ways, but never ways that we control or manage or corral or dictate, is similar to some of my other colleagues here who did not grow up in the Lutheran Church, is what kind of got me to this table. And wondering in American Lutheranism about the undercurrents of, how much was theology and how much was practice, because we as a tradition just started communing more regularly since the liturgical movement, right, of the middle last century. And I know stories of pastors or people who grew up in churches where the big resistance was the altar guild saying moving to weekly communion was going to be too expensive. But just wondering how the practice of infrequent communion, sorry, my dog's barking, what kind of theology carried on in the community? How did that grow and change with the liturgical movement? And as Anna's saying, and others are saying, and now that we're experiencing hunger, and Americans are terrible at living with hunger, right? We're terrible at living with incompletion, and the right, the idea that this is our right, R-I-G-H-T. I've been compelled by the document that people were circulating around by Dirk Lang, and the connection with, he pulls up stuff that Bonhoeffer talks about realizing we are not the first people in the world to go hungry, and relatively speaking, we're not that hungry, but we're not the first people to go hungry. And what is it to pray our way as a fast, not in a you have to fast to receive mercy, but as the solidarity piece that the table actually has preformed us and predisposed us to recognizing. But Bishop Erwin, I would be particularly, moving kind of from the Reformation to the American Lutheran experience, what do you hear in those undercurrents of even the 20th century movements? And I'll take my answer off the air. No.
Let me say quickly to that the American situation is unique because we have the frontier experience of congregations without clergy, which for the most part didn't have Holy Communion without them. But it also bred a kind of independence of spirit in regard to the need for clergy that has sometimes come into conversations like this kind of through the back door. And of course, there is an American thing that you can't tell me what to do, and no one else has the right to put any boundaries on my actions. And that just is, it is a thing. And I have been kind of resistant to the views that a few have expressed that somehow refraining from communion during this time is a power play on the part of the church. But I have to be honest to say that in some ways it has been interpreted that way in our history. That, for example, in a state church tradition, where only the formally ordained who are assigned to parishes and the parishioners are assigned to them as well, there is an element of power in that relationship, that sacramental relationship, that doesn't exist for us as modern Americans. We have a voluntaristic church. But people who came here from Norway could be resentful of a church that was not like the way they thought Christianity should be, and were resolved not to fall back into that when they got to the new land. So we have some undercurrents of that, I think, that are kind of unique to America. I don't come out of that ethnicity, but I've come to value much that's in it, and see it as part of who we are that makes us different from other kinds of Lutherans. I will also say very quickly that there was a kind of anti-liturgical movement that occurred within continental and especially German Lutheranism about 150 years after the Reformation, where in the final settlement after the 30 Years' War and all of that, the idea that Protestants should finally get their act together and be more consistent after centuries of disagreement meant that in many cases, the kind of lowest common denominator practice became standard for for Protestants generally. And that's where Lutherans took on a great number of kind of what they considered previously to be Calvinist practices, because in some ways Calvinism was intellectually more dynamic, and it was, and you know, I'm saying this as a way to say that these things aren't static and permanent, but Calvinism offered some things that Lutheranism offered a way for Lutherans to look away from some things that they had grown a bit uncomfortable with, like individual confession, which continued in a very lively way from Luther for 150 years afterwards. So in such a lively way that some Lutherans believed it was in some sense necessary, even though everybody taught formally that it wasn't. Still, social pressure makes these things seem important. And so getting rid of private confession sort of went along with a simplification of liturgy, the gradual abandonment of the historic vestments, which had never been consistently maintained, because in fact the late medieval tradition was not consistent or uniform. And so Lutherans just took this messy system and gradually morphed it themselves. But the chasuble disappears, for example, in Germany, and during a pretty short span of time, actually, because it was simpler not to have it. And a lot of this ended up being very much like what the Calvinists were already doing. So the uniformity, the growing uniformity of Protestantism meant that Lutherans abandoned some of their distinctiveness in that time.
Peter, I want to give you a chance to chime in here in general, because I know in a Zoom conversation last week, you raised some really interesting questions. And so rather than, I'll just give you a chance to kind of express your thoughts rather than me doing it for you.
So my background is out of the Roman Catholic tradition, and have been in a monastery, and there's a part of me that feels like the conversation has been a lot about what we want to do, and unanchored from eucharistic theology, you know, that where we're wrestling with those pieces. And there are parts of the eucharistic theology that I do wrestle with at this point. Case in point was, you know, I'm now doing final prayers with people just this weekend, you know, standing on the outside of a window outside of their bedroom, and they couldn't hear me, you know, and administering, you know, praying for them, and essentially administering, you know, final rite, if you will. And you know, in the counseling I had to do with the family too, we had that conversation about Christ present in this person's life throughout their whole life, and now continues to be present, and we have to reassure ourselves of Christ's presence in that room at that point. But I just wonder about, you know, what are we saying now? And I do think this is different than other times. The piece that has hit me is that the church has said, not just the church, but the government and society, you are not essential workers. Prior to this, a pastor or priest would be able to go into a room of the sick and dying person and perform those ministries. You would have gone to somebody's house to help them deal with the fear. And now we're saying we can't do that. It's not that it's not advisable. You can't. You know, I was not allowed in that room. Couldn't get there. And my question is, you know, how do we start wrestling with this honestly as people of the 21st century, using our theology as background, but not necessarily being, as you know, as some churches where if it was said before the year 500, then it's it, you know. And for us, sometimes it's, if it was said before 1600, then that's what we do. I don't feel like we're answering these questions about what does it mean to be community now that we're not allowed to get together? I certainly can go to the hermits and think about their version of what Christianity was, because that's what we sort of living right now. But even they got to gather. And how do we define what community is? And I think that part of the stress in the dialogue is that we're not defining terms. And it's not about virtual space. It's about people, especially of a certain age, for whom this, and not everybody, but for this reality of a virtual community is very real. It's not just something that happens. And then you turn the machine off and they go away. There are people for whom that's their only connection. That's their only sacramental life, if you will, in the broader sense of sacrament. So how do we address that? And if we think about the impact of other historical events, the invention of the printing press changed the way we thought about the priest, about believers and the priesthood, because now everybody had access to the magical words that only priests supposedly knew about before. And the 30 Years' War also changed substantially how the church viewed itself, because it had never before seen Christianity, well, except for maybe Byzantium, but in Europe at that point, they had never seen each other slaughter each other because of their faith in that way, and it changed their idea of church. So I wonder, I preface, or I should say that for me, we have been fasting from communion, and which I think is appropriate, but I wrestle with these other pieces. And including right down to the definition of, well, what does ordination really mean? Which I've never understood what Lutherans mean, because they treat it one way and talk about it another way, especially coming out of my background.
I think that your point is about Lutherans in terms of ordination, talk about it one way and act another way. That clearly that's the only category that we do that in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Bishop Erwin, any thoughts and reflections on some of the things that Peter has raised?
Yeah, I do have a few, and I think those are really valuable points. And I do hope, I want to say to begin with, I hope that we can harvest some deep learning from this experience that will profit us as a community and as a church going forward. I think some of that learning is being done. Some of it's being resisted. But it'll take us a long time to figure out what all this has meant and what it will mean for us going forward. I want to say, this is a very small point, but I have really strenuously resisted the language of fasting in connection with this Eucharistic deprivation, because I want to be able to lament the pain that it causes and the brokenness in my spiritual life by this absence, this real absence of something that is crucial to me. And I don't want to act like I think it's a spiritual growth opportunity. I mean, in some ways it is. Everything is, and everything isn't. But I don't want to make people think we want this in any way. Nobody wants this, and to decry it on a weekly basis is fine with me. And to articulate the pain it represents is much better than glossing it all over and saying this is just fine. So the presiding bishop used that word early on in a statement, hoping to make a kind of a virtue out of an inconvenience, and it just stuck in ways I don't think have been helpful. That being said, the way Lutherans have understood the believing community in which the body of Christ is made present in faith, not just Eucharistic, but as a fellowship of faith where Christ is with us, is one that took the medieval understandings, where in some ways you could understand the church writ large as having its ultimate communion and community in the unity with the Bishop of Rome, and that everything that kind of deviated from that was less oriented toward the center of all Christian community. Luther reduced that, took that away and built it again from the bottom up, so that the parish, the neighborhood who gather together in the church building for Eucharist are the church in an especially authentic way and sufficient to be the church. And we have some really strong strains of that still in our American Lutheran theology and even in our constitutional setup for the ELCA. But in some ways, I think maybe we overdid it because we have not believed that communion in the sense of agreement in faith and practice and a deep sense of spiritual connectedness has been a reality from congregation to congregation, from congregations within a synod, within a denomination, or within an international movement of faith, which is what Lutheranism is. And we've lost that. And I just want to say, as somebody who in my own spiritual development had kind of I've always had an intellectual appreciation of Roman Catholicism without being able fully to enter into the cultural aspects that it represents. I felt that in some odd way, this Holy Week and Easter were almost holier, or they were holy in a different way than any other I had ever experienced. Because when I watched the Pope live with 40 people in St. Peter's doing the Easter Vigil, I was able to commune with them because literally he was the only one who consumed the bread and wine. And I was in exactly the same situation as the other 39 people who were watching in the room and the hundreds of thousands watching around the world. And we were communing together in a sense because we were not communing. And that sense of unity with Christianity as a whole, I found very powerful. It brought me to tears. And it's the first time in my life I've ever been able to do that, because up to now, the being excluded from that Eucharistic fellowship was the main way I understood it. And so I think there's some learning in here for all of us about what communion in the sense of church means. And I hope we can harvest some of that too.
Indeed. And I think that's maybe part of the imagination, Anna, you were touching on it, and it connects with theological thinking. You know, how can this be a time when we learn not only about practices, but also our theology, to point out what Peter said too. You know, is this an opportunity for us in our congregations to do some more teaching around the Eucharist? And you know, Americans are very pragmatic, very transactional people, and we bring that kind of understanding of life in general, we bring that into our congregations and worship life. That's fine to a point, but, and I want to give, Bishop Erwin, I want to give you a chance to kind of any closing thoughts on that in particular, because this is one of the pieces that I've noticed, is that there is a certain transactional quality in our understanding of communion. And any thoughts on that as it pertains to this whole question going forward of how are we going to be in communion? How are we going to worship? And how is the church going to use this as an opportunity to grow? And I'm using the word grow in the sense of, you know, a deepening of its understanding and faithfulness. Any closing thoughts you want to share with us? So we could clearly go on for an hour or so more with this, but I want to be cognizant of everybody's time.
I want to say a little bit so that people wouldn't misunderstand that I very much appreciate the conversation that we're having about virtual community and all the wonderful ways in which people can feel connected. I mean, as I described, my sense of connectedness to the Eucharist being performed in Rome, half a world away, because I could watch it live on television and know that in a way I was as much a part of it as anyone there. That's a real thing, and it's a good thing, and it's a powerful thing, and it's an opportunity for us not only to be connected, but also to evangelize, I think, to let people know what we care about. So that's well and good. I do want to lift up, though, that a much deeper conversation needs to be held about the nature of reality as it is experienced on screens and as it is experienced in person. And one thing that Lutheranism has to contribute to that conversation, perhaps uniquely among the denominational traditions, the theological traditions, is that we have this doctrine developed again over and against Calvinist understandings, that it is possible for the infinite to be present in the finite. And that's how God can be in the Eucharist. That's how Christ can be with God in everything that God is. And that's how everything is connected in a way. So it has been important for me that we are a church that believes that God became flesh, that the Word is flesh, that the meal is real, that we are the church when we are together. And that doesn't exclude every other understanding of togetherness, but it does privilege the face-to-face communication that we can enjoy. And obviously up to now, we've been talking about what it means when we can't be together face-to-face, and so we've looked for other things, other ways to get the sense of community apart from the physical presence. And we can do that. But I just want to lift up that we should not forget that it is the face-to-face that we still desire and we will come back to at some point in some ways, and that rather than trying to create a sense of how it used to be using virtual means, we should rather consider how to do new things until we can go back to doing the old things. And even then, I don't believe we'll go back to doing the old things in the same way. I mean, what if we don't get to serve communion in both kinds for a year? And I think that's a real possibility. I'm thinking of recommending to my pastors that they simply not offer the wine. And there are lots of things we're going to have to wrestle with. But that question of what's real, I'm still worried about the manipulative power of broadcast connectivity, and the same ick factor that led us to believe that a radio evangelist was doing something wrong when they asked you to put your elements on top of the radio. This is really still pertinent in some ways, at least for me. I'm an old person, so I see the kind of relative growth of this, that just because it was on TV didn't make it more real than it had been on the radio. Just because it's now synchronous doesn't make it more real than it was when it wasn't synchronous. And so we just have to not be so in love with the technology that we think we've answered all our problems that way.
I appreciate that so much. And because in a sense, this is a real gathering in the sense that we can see each other and talk to each other and be connected, but it's not a bodily presence.
That's right.
And if that's what's central to the Eucharist.
Yeah.
And just one other thing I didn't get to add in before is that having the community together to make this happen is actually, clericalism has come up. And I think the necessity of the community actually reduces the clericalism of, if it's my incantation of words that makes the Eucharist, that's clericalism, versus us together, the body together, our enfleshed bodies gathering around the body of Christ and then becoming the body of Christ. That's what makes the Eucharist. That is a communal understanding versus me on a screen saying something being what consecrates this meal.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I'll admit that just in the spectrum of things that make me more or less comfortable, it makes me less uncomfortable to think that people who are so hungry for the Eucharist that they want to go to extraordinary lengths to provide it for themselves would take matters into their own hands and do this at their own kitchen tables without a pastor. That I find less objectionable than the idea that a pastor can project this magic through the digital means onto their kitchen table for them.
Yep.
Although neither is perfectly desirable. Patience should be what we teach instead.
No, and I agree. And I think another thing that sort of me saying the words over Zoom kind of takes away is one thing that we've been talking a lot about within our church is that Jesus always tends to show up at mealtimes. And so when we talked about the road to Emmaus, that's one of the things that I talked about, is that all Christians are called to bless. And so Jesus is still showing up at your table, maybe not in bread and wine in the Eucharist, but Jesus is still showing up and you can still bless. And so one of the things I hope when all this is over is that I'll actually hear a little less of, hey, Pastor, will you bless the food? Because all Christians are called to bless, whether it's what they eat or what they find grace in. So I think that's one of the opportunities of this moment.
Wow. And on that note, I'm going to step in and wrap this up because it could go on. And what I like about this conversation is we've clearly opened up more than we've closed. But that's okay. That's the nature of how this learning is going to go forward. So I want to thank everybody for all of your input, your thoughts, your questions, your observations. Particularly want to thank Bishop Erwin for taking some time out, getting up early on the West Coast, and hope that you had a good, strong cup of coffee. It certainly sounded like it to me. So thank you, everybody, for participating in this.